Hello and welcome to Kickback Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Luke. This podcast is your place to get the tools and knowledge necessary to navigate the world of health and wellness. So kick back and let's talk science. This is good content. This stuff has gone great. We'll jump into it. Let's dive in. Let's do a little science. I'm going nitty gritty science right now.
I've been looking forward to this.
Kind of going on a little bit of a tangent.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
The information we discuss in this podcast is not meant to be taken as medical advice. It is simply informative. We're not affiliated with any organization or institution, just a few guys talking science and having fun.
How you doing, guys?
Yo, yeah.
Good, I miss you guys.
Oh, you didn't do it on that last one, did you? I don't think
Oh,
you
he
did.
missed us.
No, if I didn't, I hope you saw it in my eyes.
I did. I saw it. I know you're always missing us.
I was walking Cato this morning.
I miss you
like,
too.
I was like, Cato, the boys are coming over. He was like, what? What's the topic? And I was like, calorie restriction. He's like, oh, are you going to talk about the issues of overconsumption in the United States? I was like, oh, yeah. I mean, I'm sure it'll come up.
He kind of sounds like Scooby a little bit. Excited to be back here.
Oh, yeah, dude. This is
Me
fun.
too.
We got a good one today. I'm excited about this one.
What do we got?
Well, this one, we got another matchup in our diet series, guys.
Mm.
Any guesses on what the matchup is?
Is it the Sixers Celtics?
Close. Joe?
Hit us with it.
All right. It's going to be calorie restriction going head-to-head with, drumroll, intermittent fasting.
Ooh-wee.
This is an excellent one because myself, I do intermittent fasting. Joe, I believe
I
you
do
also
too.
do as well.
You're right.
So
You
I'm
guys.
excited to see who's going to win this one. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Luke, let's start
Like
with...
you're both actively doing
Yeah.
intermittent fasting.
I've been doing
Except
it
for
for
on the
years.
weekends, I kind of screw it up.
Wow.
I
All
try.
right.
I try.
I've been doing it for years.
11 to
Amy
7.
just started doing it as well.
Okay.
11 to 7 is my window.
Well, we'll see if you're still doing it at the end of the podcast.
So let's
That's not a hint at anything. I'm not giving away.
dive
anything.
into calorie restriction first. In
I'm
this
down.
matchup.
I'm down. Start
Go.
with calorie restriction. Yeah. Okay. So as far as calorie restriction and really what the benefits may likely come from, in order to get into that, we really have to talk about why would we calorie restrict anyways? And everyone's probably aware of this epidemic of obesity, especially in the United States. And when you look into the research of obesity, you see that it's related to so many other issues of your health. So the metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and you name it, obesity contributes to that. Or there are these comorbidities that exist with obesity, so it impacts your health in other ways. And obesity is really complex. It's not just like, oh, you have large amount of body fat, therefore you're obese. Now, so many other processes within your body get disrupted when you are metabolically unhealthy, which leads to obesity. And all of these seem to stem from one thing. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say one thing. There's a variety of things, but all of these seem to stem from this overconsumption or increased energy intake with a decreased energy output. So when you're taking in a lot of energy and you're not utilizing that energy, your body has to store it. And one of the fuels that we need to keep at a very consistent level is glucose. You get glucose from carbohydrates that you take in. When you take in these carbohydrates, they're going to circulate around in the blood as glucose. Now, your body monitors blood glucose levels at all times. You have a set point that needs to be maintained. If it's too low, your body's not able to use those fuels and it's not going to function properly. If it's too high, it's going to have an impact on blood vessels, organs, and so on. And so it's got to kind of stay at a set point level. And in order to do that, let's say you take in a bunch of carbohydrates, you have high glucose circulating around the bloodstream, your body's like, whoa, let's get this shit somewhere safe and not have it circulating around the blood. Turns out the bulk of that glucose is going to be stored within the muscle. 75 to 80% of glucose is stored within the muscle. It gets stored as glycogen. So goes into the muscle cell and gets converted into glycogen. And excess glucose can also get converted into fat. So de novo lipogenesis is what it's called, happens in the liver and can convert glucose into triglycerides that get brought to fat cells and get stored. And when you have this increase in energy, I don't want to put a bad name on carbohydrates specifically, because your body is going to be creating glucose from not just the carbohydrates that you're taking in, but an increase in energy consumption increases this fuel that your body has to dispose of. And glucose is the one fuel that you don't want high amounts of. So your body's like, whoa, we got to get rid of it. Let's store it as fat. That process, as it happens over and over, and you're basically telling your liver like, hey, take care of this glucose. Your liver is so focused on taking care of this glucose, and it can't keep up with the conversion of glucose to fat, that de novo lipogenesis. So that increase is causing a buildup of fat within the liver. Now, when that buildup of fat happens within the liver, then you get what's called NAFLD, or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And that fat accumulation, the reason this is a disease is because of what that accumulation does to other aspects of metabolism. So it impairs your liver's ability to go through more de novo lipogenesis. And so it actually slows down that process and makes this snowball effect of, okay, now you've got fat accumulation. Now your liver can't convert this glucose, and it's getting worse and worse. So glucose is piling up. That's going to impact every other organ system. So when you have this increased energy intake, that's just one example of what happens. Now, this also happens within the muscle cell itself. So increased glucose. Now, muscle's so good at storing it. It's like, yo, I'll help out with this. Give me your glucose. I'll watch them for a while. And the process of getting glucose into the muscle cell requires insulin. Insulin gets secreted from your pancreas and goes out and grabs that glucose and is like, yo, muscle cell, take care of this because we don't want a lot of it. And so insulin has to come to the muscle cell and dispose of that glucose. Now, it doesn't just freely flow in. Insulin has to kind of knock on the door and ask the muscle cell, like, hey, are you okay taking this glucose? Could you watch it for a while? The muscle cell can say no, and it does say no if it's got too much glucose in it, and if it gets too much fat within it to build up of all this fat inside the muscle cell.
So you're talking glucose, too much, too little. Is there a way to measure that number that you're getting?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways. When you go in to the clinic, a lot of times you'll get a fasting blood glucose level.
Okay.
And so for fasting blood glucose, you're going to want to look for somewhere below 100 milligrams per deciliter. When you're fasting, that's when you're not taking fuel. That's the amount that your body's trying to keep in circulation. But that just tells you this one time point. And the problem with that is glucose fluctuates so often. And so, years ago, we developed this, I shouldn't say I wasn't a part of this process, but an ability to look at long-term glucose circulation came around, and that's hemoglobin A1C. And what this is it's actually looking at your red blood cells and seeing how much of that red blood cell, what percent is glycosylated. So not just red blood cells, endothelial cells, which line blood vessels and organs, they can get glycosylated by that increased glucose. And essentially that's just glucose going in and almost like attaching itself to that cell or part of that cell. And so if you have higher amounts of glucose, you get larger percentages of glycosylated hemoglobin, which is in the red blood cell. Red blood cells live for about 3 months. And so when you check hemoglobin A1C levels, again, that's the percentage of the glycosylated hemoglobin, you kind of get an idea of what's going on the last 90 days because you've got the red blood cell now. So it's a better metric than just seeing someone who comes in with a fasting glucose. I mean, having a fasting glucose like over like 200, for example, that can sound the alarms right away because that should never happen. But if you're right around, if you're elevated at that like 120 or so, it's not going to be as much of a problem because you don't know much about what could have increased that glucose. Stress can increase circulating glucose levels. So hemoglobin A1C is the way to go. And fasting glucose is another metric there.
Okay. So is there any way to measure it without going into a doctor? Is it like, can you measure it by your intake of food? Like what you take? Kind of like protein?
No, there's just too much at play.
Okay.
For circulating glucose levels. You can measure how much carbohydrate you're taking in, and that's a good indicator of, are you taking in too much glucose or not? Because carbohydrates get converted into glucose. But the problem with that, it doesn't tell you how much is circulating in your body because, again, there's gluconeogenesis happens where your liver converts certain amino acids into glucose. And even fatty acids can go through this process as well. So yeah, you can't really get an idea just based on diet alone. But anyway, so with this increase in fuel and your body's response to it is to try to store it. It's going to store excess fat, and fat's going to build up within organs. The dangerous organs to have fat build up in is the liver and then also the muscle. I mean, having fat build up anywhere is not going to be healthy if it's excess fat. But we see these metabolic impairments happen with muscle specifically. That's where type 2 diabetes comes in. You have this insulin resistance. So insulin, again, bringing that glucose to the muscle cell. The muscle cell becomes resistant. It's like, nah, you know what? I've got too much. I'm not going to let insulin give me that glucose. Sorry, next. And so insulin isn't able to get the glucose into the blood. Your body responds by ramping up insulin levels then. So all of a sudden you get this crazy high amount of insulin over and over because your body's like, whoa, we still got a lot of glucose. Insulin, go do your job. And so you'll make more insulin, secrete it. And insulin has its own negative impacts. And so you've got all these processes that just start to spiral out of control. I mean, I'm just talking about a couple of them. And they all stem from this excess energy. So this over energy intake and low energy output. Now, if you burn off those calories, you don't have that issue, right? You don't have to store this energy. Your liver doesn't have to go through these processes of de novo lipogenesis, getting fat accumulation, which slows down the liver's ability to do what else it's supposed to be doing. And you get predisposed to all these diseases. And so again, it all comes down to energy intake. So then it's like, well, if we reduce energy intake, what happens? So that's where the calorie restriction comes in. And we've been doing calorie restriction type research for quite a while. Back in like the 1920s, they were doing restriction models, and it was actually with the intention of studying malnutrition. So how low of a calorie intake can you have and still be healthy? And they're doing these in animal models. And so with mice and rats, and they're finding these crazy outcomes of like, whoa, we were just trying not to kill them. Turns out they're living so much longer. I mean, on the order of 40 to 50% longer if they're calorically restricted. And
what kind of caloric restriction are we talking? Like how much restriction?
So some of these papers go all the way up to like 70% calorie restriction. But I mean, I don't have the average numbers ahead of me, but when I look at these papers, a lot of them are like 25 down to like 50% calorie restriction. And it varies though, but you get the same outcome with calorie restriction of increased what we call longevity. So lifespan is improving. And not only is lifespan improving, but you look at these animals and they are not getting this decline in organ function that I'm talking about. So they're not getting this increased adipose tissue and diabetes, because mice do develop these diseases with age. They lose lean body mass, they increase body fat. Wow. And that's why they're a good model to study on certain things. We're going to talk about why, or not really why, but because we don't know why, but there's certain things like diet research that they just like don't, they're so different than us, and nothing seems to play out the way it does in animals as it does in humans. But, so we've got this animal model that's showing us, okay, having less calories seems to be good for my health. And so those studies are just replicated time and time again. And this is an important point in terms of research in that I'm talking about replication of an experiment. If you see a study done that's never been done before, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, like red meat causes cancer, right?
Whoa, dude.
Yeah, so like certain types of things, like if that study can't be replicated in another lab, chances are there is some sort of error in the research. So there's a couple different types of errors, type 1 and type 2 error, where either you saw significance but there wasn't, or you didn't see significance but there was. And that tends to be because your study is not what's called powered correctly. You don't have enough participants. You didn't set up the experimental design to actually show you the outcome you're looking at. And the media doesn't realize this stuff, and they see one paper come out and then just jump on it like the red meat causes cancer. But if you don't see this replicated in other labs, then again, it's probably some artifact of some sort of error that was done in the study design. And that has nothing to do with the researchers. You know, they learn from this process. You know, when we design studies, so like when I was doing my PhD, I had to do a power analysis. I had to go in and see, okay, what am I trying to look for? What outcomes am I expecting to see in this population I'm studying? And how many participants do I need in each group, therefore, to then know if this outcome is legit or not? And so people will do this, and these experiments will evolve over time. If you see something time and time again, if you see the same outcome happening with the same experimental design, you can easily just say, okay, there's something here. And that's what was happening with these animal models of calorie restriction. It's pretty impressive. So, but the problem is like, okay, mice, sure. Now, humans, it's hard to do these calorie restriction models. There was, you know, during like World War I, they did some studies on people that were just naturally calorie restricted and saw some benefits from people, but it was just hard to study because there's so many other things happening during that time period and with these participants. And we didn't know the safety and efficacy of calorie restriction to the point where we could comfortably do it, you know, tell people like, okay, eat less, because ethically you need to know if there's a risk to some sort of intervention before you do a lot of these experiments, and those risks play out with animal studies. So the evolution of the mouse rat studies went then to monkeys, and this is up there with probably, I could say it's the most heavily debated study that exists. And this is like across all areas of research. And as I pointed out, I imagine you're going to hear it come up more now as you understand what it is, because I know both of you are so like into nutrition and your overall health, and
I'm in a calorie deficit on a regular basis.
Yeah, well, and like you're in a calories deficit for a health reason. So I mean, like you're searching information, you're going to see this study come up. So what it is the largest study in calorie restriction, and the unfortunate part is it will never be replicated. It was so hard to do. It's not going to get approved again for a variety of reasons. It took so long, but it is like the calorie restriction study to end all calorie restriction studies, because I don't know how we're going to, until we can do such a highly controlled human trial, like we're not going to get the amount of information we could have gotten. Now, the problem is, and I'll talk about why, like it sucks they didn't design things in a certain way. It wasn't the researchers' fault, but it sucks that things played out the way they did. Now, how all this started is a group of rhesus macaques. So rhesus monkeys went to macaque. Rhesus monkeys went.
I thought I heard
I
that.
saw the smile on your face. So these monkeys, which are very, very genetically close to humans. So that's why this is so applicable here. They were born in captivity in a lab, a primate research center down at UW in Madison, so University of Wisconsin. And they decided to do a calorie restriction study in these monkeys. And they reduced calories 30%, had same portion of macronutrients for these monkeys, and they just watched what happened. So over time, this was decades. The lifespan of a monkey, or these types of monkeys, are 35 to sometimes even over 40 years. And well, on average in captivity, though, it was 26 years. But anyway, they're monitoring this over years and years and years and years and years, and just seeing what happens when you restrict 30% calories. That's all they were doing. And they found a significant increase in life and health span in the monkeys that were calorically restricted versus the monkeys that could eat as much as they wanted. And now you got to think about, like, this is an environment not like us as US citizens that could just go on our phone and order something from Uber Eats and have it delivered to our door. You know, like, we have this predisposed overconsumption issue, whereas these monkeys don't. So they're not going to overconsume quite as much potentially. And we'll talk about why they may have. But anyway, calorie restriction improved lifespan. Now, this was a huge study, huge significance. It's easy to see, like, oh, calorie restriction, this is pretty incredible. Now, there was a study done in Bethesda, Maryland, sponsored by the NIA, and they did the same exact study. Because again, I talk about this replicating research. You know, you showed it in one lab, let's see, does it work in another lab? So they did the exact same thing in another lab, and they found no significant difference. So 30% reduction in calories, but there was no increase in lifespan. So then that had everyone freaking out of like, whoa, like, we just published all these news articles. The first paper was in 2009. The second one was in 2012. And everyone's like, whoa, we just said eat less, live longer. And now this Maryland study is telling us it doesn't make a difference. What the hell's going on? And so the whole research world, especially like people in these calorie restriction models, start diving into this research and seeing what the hell could be happening to explain. How do you explain this? And so now I'm going to paint this picture of the study designs for you a little bit. So imagine me painting, a picture. So the Wisconsin study, all these primates were born and lived in captivity. They waited till they were 8 years old. So after they were fully developed, at that age, they're fully developed. They've grown as much muscle mass as they're going to. They're as tall and as big as they're going to get. Then they introduced the calorie restricted diet. So when they were growing up, they could eat whatever they wanted. So 8 years old, 30% calorie reduced. 2 different groups, males and females in both of them. And then just monitor them. Now the diet they gave them, though, the diet that they eat in this captivity situation, is what they wanted to do is mimic a standard American diet. And so they had processed foods with 28.5% of calorie intake being sugar. And it was supposed to, again, resemble what we eat as Americans. And so when you look at the Bethesda study, the NIA study in 2012, what they did, are you looking at my shirt?
Yeah. Kind of want a hot dog.
It's all fun and games until someone loses a wiener. You can't, maybe you can see it. You got to watch the video. So you look at the NIA study, and they actually picked a diet that was similar to what these monkeys would eat in the wild. And it's almost like a pescatarian diet in a way, where most of their protein came from fish, but it was a lot of just vegetables, and that's what they would eat in their diet. And only 3% of it was that sucrose intake, whereas 28.5 in the Wisconsin study. So a much healthier diet. And so then now everyone with just that information is like, oh, if you're eating a shitty diet, reducing calories helps you. But if you're eating healthy, reducing calories doesn't help you. And that could explain it, right? That makes sense. But it doesn't stop there. So you look more into the data and you see the control group in the NIA. So the one that's supposed to eat as much as it wants with the healthy diet was actually calorie restricted relative to the control group in Wisconsin. So now you're like, whoa, they still were calorie restricted. And you're trying to compare 2 calorie restricted groups. Well, you can't do that. And when you look at the difference between Wisconsin primates and the NIA, these monkeys in the calorie restricted group in Wisconsin were living to similar lifespans as the groups in the NIA. And so it just sucks that they weren't eating as many calories, but the researchers, they didn't realize this till, you look at calorie intake. And so both groups were calorie restricted. So it still doesn't tell us, is it calorie restriction? Now, some more confounding variables come into play then. The NIA monkeys were not born in captivity. They were sent from these areas of China and India. And these Chinese and Indian populations of these monkeys are actually quite genetically different. They're different in size and a lot of other aspects. And so you've got different monkeys, especially relative to the Wisconsin that was held in captivity. Sure, they resemble more of what they're in the wild, but you're trying to compare these different monkeys. Plus, they grouped them and started calorie restriction at as young as 1 year old. In the males, they grouped them into juvenile, adolescent, and adults, and did the same in females. But the males, they started at as low as 1 to 2 years old. And then in females, they started 1 to 3 years old. And some of the monkeys weren't even starting calorie restriction until they were 16 years old in both groups. So much later. And so they didn't have this highly controlled study like the Wisconsin study did, where they started everyone, well, it was 7 to 9 years old, but on average of 8 years old. They started them at different phases. And they found in the NAA, when you look further into the data, these monkeys that started calorie restriction earlier on actually had less health benefits. They weren't living quite as long. And so that then comes to the point of like, oh, if you're going to calorie restrict, probably don't want to do it when you're developing, right? And the Wisconsin study showed that too. You start after development. And then as you age, introducing this calorie restriction can benefit your health. But again, it's like, is it the calorie restriction, or is it just from being obese and over consuming in this model with Wisconsin? Because sure, they're probably not over consuming similar to what we do as Americans, but 25% of these monkeys in the control group in the Wisconsin study had pre-diabetes. They had this metabolic issue that I was talking about with overconsumption. So that high sugar intake actually probably had a similar impact that it does on us, where when you have high, processed sugars and cookies and desserts and stuff, that stimulates appetite more and you end up overconsuming. So is it calorie restriction, or is it because they were metabolically unhealthy and had more body fat? We don't know. And the authors, people don't talk about that stuff I just brought up. People are just like, well, the studies show us that processed foods are the bad thing, not calories, because the NIA didn't show any difference. They showed that they were eating a healthy diet, but they don't go further into the details of like, no, that's not what it's telling us, because the control group was still calorie restricted. So, in the Wisconsin group, they were still on this processed food diet and living incredibly long when they were calorie restricted. So is it the processed food? Probably not, in my opinion. And the authors came out with another paper from the NIA study because they realized, whoa, okay, there's a lot to unpack in this data here. Yeah, we didn't really just like add to this existing study. We created more confusion. And so in their, it was called a reconciliation paper, where essentially they were just telling the world like, hey, you're taking this information at face value. You got to look into what we did. And they weren't saying we did a bad job. They did a great job with the study design. It's just the outcomes played out the way they did. And they're like, you got to look further into our data, like see that they're calorie restricted. So it's this group of studies that still don't answer the question, but what it is showing is that overconsumption in some form is not going to be healthy for us. And calorie restriction still is aiming that like, okay, this is going to be beneficial. I just, I bring those up because it's a hot debated topic with people that are so like, oh, don't eat processed foods. And like being so anti-processed foods. Now, the problem with processed foods is actually likely coming from the fact that they're not nutrient dense and they're stimulating this appetite and not suppressing or not activating satiety. And so you end up eating more. And it all comes back to this overconsumption. That's where I'm taking everything, is overconsumption. Have I even let you guys talk yet?
No. But the thing is, you're talking about these studies, and I don't know the studies, so that's why we are not talking.
Yes.
So
Super
you also
interesting,
haven't
yeah.
had a second. I talk so much. I need more water.
But I'm trying to relate this to a real world scenario, right? And I'm struggling with that. Just because they're monkeys and we're similar. So overconsumption in the U.S. is very relevant, right? And that's what you're saying. Does calorie restriction benefit in the end? Is what are you saying that calorie restriction is good?
Yeah, I mean that's where we're at right now.
Okay.
Now, the problem comes into play with these human studies, and there's been a couple relatively recent meta-analyses. There's nothing like in the last few months. I was kind of hoping we'd have another update before we talk about this topic, but there's a couple pretty large meta-analyses from 2020, and both papers just looked at what are the health implications of calorie restriction. And they both found benefits in body composition, cholesterol, metabolic health, and more, and didn't find negative impacts. And these are, short studies that are done. There were a couple clinical trials, one of them being the Calorie study, Calerie. This was a clinical trial that was broken up into different phases. And it stands for Comprehensive Assessment of Long-Term Effects of Reducing Energy. And they took people and calorie restricted them for a period of 6 to 12 months for their phase 1. And we're just seeing, okay, how long can they maintain calorie restriction? Can they handle it well? Are they still healthy long term? And it's only 6 to 12 months. But on average, they were 12 to 18% calorie restricted in this clinical trial. And they handled it perfectly fine. The participants were like, yeah, that wasn't so severe of an impact. But they made sure to be low calories, but not undernourished. So you want to make sure you're getting high amounts of protein in. And you don't want to sacrifice protein intake because then you're malnourished.
So in this study, did they regulate their food or were they doing it on their own?
So this study, they had a period of time to educate the participants on calorie intake, and they actually kind of guided them, but didn't provide them the food for the whole period of time. But they had a pretty controlled way to check in and have these food logs and check up to make sure people are following these diets. And if they were not calorie restricted at the end, they reported that stuff. And so in phase 1, 6 to 12 months, it showed, okay, people are handling this just fine. Their health is still improving. Let's go a little longer here. And then they went out to 2 years. So they went to 2 years and tried to have people go 25% calorie restricted in these groups of people. And they again, just checked in and tried to have them restrict calories versus eat as much as you want. And they showed that the people eating the standard diet were not over consuming. So it didn't result in this change in body weight. And so you're not comparing overconsumption to underconsumption. You're comparing what's called a eukaloric diet or calories maintained body composition versus a 25% reduction in calorie restriction. Now, after the 2 years was done, they went back in and looked at adherence. Adherence levels were super high. It was 96%, meaning that people in the calorie restricted diet, a majority of them did just fine. And in a nutrition study, to have 96% adherence rate, that's so hard. Yeah. It's so hard to get humans to do anything, let alone for 2 freaking years. And so, but the problem is well, this isn't a problem. They weren't able to stick to 25% when they went back in and looked at the food logs. On average, they fell at 11.7% calorie restricted. So similar to that phase 1 trial of okay, there's this kind of 10 to 20% that people seem to fall in. 25% may be too difficult to sustain long term. And it may not be that it's too difficult, but physiologically, but too difficult to track and so on. But essentially they were able to do this for 2 years and still showed the same benefits. And, we'll see as this stuff continues to play out. But it is pretty evident that calorie restriction has implications on our health, especially at this time right now where people are eating so much food and over-consuming all these calories and at such a health risk. But the problem comes in when you look at people that are calorically restricted, what they tend to do. So if I say this and I say, okay, calorie restricted, it's better for your health. What you'll do is just cut how much food you're eating day to day. You're going to cut protein, carbs, and fat. And we were just kind of talking about, you don't want to be malnourished. you need to keep that protein at the same exact level. Protein is not a percentage of your diet. And I want to highlight that. Carbs and fats, sure, make those a percentage of your diet, however you want to fluctuate the percentages. We'll talk about that when we debate low carb, high fat, and then low fat, high carb, those diets. But those can work as percentages. Protein should not change. That is an absolute value, and that is relative to body weight. So if you want to know more about protein, go into the protein podcast. We'll break it down a ton. But that doesn't change. So when you calorically restrict, keep that protein at the same exact level. However many calories that fills up for your diet, then you fill in the carbs and fat. And that's going to help you preserve lean body mass so you can stay healthy. And you can even build lean body mass in a caloric deficit if you're increasing protein and doing resistance training. But it's going to allow you to cut body fat. So your body composition improves. If you drop weight on a calorie restricted diet and you lose a majority of it as lean mass, which is what happens when people don't focus on the protein, you're so much less healthy than when you started. And so it's not, don't go on a calorie restricted diet unless you're focusing on your protein.
You know what's the problem with the calorie deficit diet is, like, for me, man, I'm going into that blind and I'm like doing exactly what you just said, just cutting everything down and not keeping my protein as high as I can.
Well, and you fall into the pool with a lot of older people, or not a lot of older.
I mean, a lot of.
I just read a note on my screen that said, "Oh, a lot of other people."
I mean, it's just like not knowing how to do it, but you're
just thinking, "Oh, you hear calorie restriction."
Yeah, it blasts all over the place, and you're like, you know what? I'm gonna try that. Intermittent fasting, calorie deficit, all of it together. Why not? Let's try it out. I mean, I did lose a lot of weight, but I was just stepping on a scale, not measuring my numbers properly.
Exactly. So losing weight isn't going to tell you anything. You need to know how metabolically healthy you are, how much lean body mass you have, and how much body fat. People are so driven by weight, and it just should not be a goal that you have. Now, like when you talk about, I brought up old people by accident, but we'll talk about
Joe's an old person.
So,
Yeah, dude, I'm so old.
Like this gets into a problem with older people where you need a higher amount of protein as you age because your body becomes less efficient at going through protein synthesis. And so you need to increase protein even more to allow lean body mass to be preserved.
What age does that start? Is there like a certain number? I'm sure it's probably different for everybody, but like when should people really be increasing that protein? Like what age?
So I would say, well, after you fully develop, once you're done growing at about 25, you're going to tend to increase protein throughout the decades.
So are you calling people older than 25 old?
Yes, we're all old here. Well, we're done growing. Yeah. Now we're working on, I mean, we can still build plenty of lean mass. And there's studies that show people can build lean mass like well into even their 70s. And there was a paper with strength adaptations with squatting in 80-year-old individuals that showed they improved strength adaptations and such. So like, you can still do this, but you have the capacity, the capacity is so much lower as you age. There's a cool study that looks at strength and muscle mass. And these are two separate studies, actually. One just looking at a DEXA scan of individuals as they age. And once you get into that 8th decade of life, so when you're in your 70s, your amount of muscle mass seems to just tank. You can watch this plot and it just drops like crazy. Same thing happens with strength. Now, what we don't know is that because you're less active, because we know that's true as you age, or are you less active because you're weaker? We don't know which one's causing which, but we do know it's happening. And so it becomes especially important to preserve lean body mass at that age. And so when people calorie restrict, it becomes really popular as you get older, like, oh, you've got this accumulation of fat because you're under the impression that your metabolism has slowed down and you are like going to build all or more fat. And so older people tend to calorie restrict for their health and they don't focus on protein. now you've got a population of people that are already at risk of being in a catabolic state, breaking down lean mass, being unhealthy just in general. And now they're restricting even more to accelerate it. So it's making them way, way less healthy. And even like calorie restriction models, so we don't have this in human studies is the unfortunate part, but there are, there's a pretty elegant study done with mice that had them do 3 months. So the first 3 months that they were living, they were eating whatever they wanted. And then they divided them for weeks, first 3 weeks. And then they had them, I was right. It's months. So 3 months, eat whatever you want. 21 months after that, they split them into 2 groups, either eat whatever you want or be calorically restricted. And the caloric restriction was 40%. And then after 21 weeks, they decided to either keep the calorie restricted group calorie restricted or to then let them eat whatever they want after that period of time. And then the ad lib group, which means eat whatever you want, they let them either keep eating whatever you want or now you're going to become calorie restricted. So you got 4 groups here. One is a mouse who's been calorie restricted who stays calorie restricted. A mouse who's been calorie restricted that all of a sudden gets to eat whatever it wants late in life. A mouse that's been eating whatever it wants and is now calorie restricted late in life. And then a mouse that's eating whatever it wants its whole life. And it's supposed to resemble if you do calorie restriction early versus late in life. And they found that doing the calorie restriction diet later in life did not have the benefits that the mouse who did calorie restriction earlier and then ate whatever it wanted later on. And so there seems to be this impact of that. And that kind of is represented in the monkey study as well of like, okay, these calorie restricted individuals that started in this middle group where, they've got this ability to build lean body mass tended to live a little bit longer. And I should point out the NAA study is actually still ongoing. Some of these monkeys are still living and they're living to like record ages and such. So we haven't seen all the data that we're going to see from this study. But that this idea of like, okay, if you're calorie restricting way late in life, you might actually be doing yourself a disservice. I mean, but again, we haven't seen that in the human trials, so we don't know the answer to that, but it makes sense because people who are older calorie restrict and they're in this catabolic state and then you just accelerate that.
And they're probably done trying to eat healthy. They're like, you know what? I'm going to start smoking cigarettes. I'm going to start eating McDonald's every day.
Yeah. Well, and
cooking might be an issue. They're like, I just don't want to cook right now. So they go get frozen foods, pop it in the microwave.
Yeah.
That type of stuff. Like if you can't control that in one of the studies, like I guess this isn't a study, but at that point, they're just eating 1 to 2 meals a day because they just don't do the work themselves.
Well, and you get that age group that they tend to be less active too, especially resistance training. I mean, we know now how important it is for people who are older to do strength training, but you look at like generations before, it's not viewed the same way at all. It's like, what? I don't need to be a bodybuilder. And so like people who are older right now tend to do way less resistance training when we know it's like, oh my gosh, you're the population that would benefit more than anyone else in this world.
Well, and like us at our age, 35,
32,
32, 32,
29.
29?
Yeah.
God, jerk.
I'm still living in my 20s.
Yeah.
I mean, I think working out has been a part of my life since I was 15. And I can't see myself not going.
Right.
And it's easier for me to see myself at 70 years old, still going to the gym, still trying to take care of my body. Building muscle, maybe not, but sustaining it, yes. Just trying to stay active. I mean,
right.
And like you were just saying, like my parents, that was not part of their lifestyle.
Exactly. And that's true. I mean, is that true with your parents?
Yeah, my dad thinks getting in and out of cars is exercise. That'll maintain his muscle mass. I'm like, I mean, it's better than nothing, but like you actually got to get some resistance going and like increase your heart rate. And
it's just a hard conversation to have. Like I've had that with people in my life that are older that I'm like, you know what? If you don't build muscle now, you're going to regret it when you get to the point where you don't have the ability to build muscle anymore.
Yeah, and then with the calorie deficit at that age, like you just said, it's probably not the time to be doing it. You're going to be needing to eat more,
right,
in order to maintain your muscle.
Yeah, and it comes from this like weight loss thing of everyone's so obsessed with losing weight. Like, if you want to lose weight, start smoking cigarettes. It's phenomenal. And you're going to have the same effect as if you're calorie restricted and undernourished. You're going to lose a shit ton of weight. And it's going to show up on the scale. So yeah, if weight loss is your only goal and you don't care how healthy you are, which is what so many people do when they restrict calories, go ahead, just start smoking cigarettes. Reed's laughing at me because he's worried about me saying that.
Yeah,
no, of course, that's a joke. Don't smoke cigarettes.
Just, I guess focus on your protein and keep that up. And I guess if you're not cooking yourself at an older age and you're trying to do the easy thing because you're just not all there, right? I guess, I don't know. But if you can focus on your protein and be in a calorie deficit, whether it's on purpose or not, while resistance training, that would be like the way to go.
Right.
And then my question is, how did they determine what their calorie intake was in those studies? Like you hear everybody say 2,000 calories. That's like the golden standard. But like when I was a trainer, we had the RESI and metabolic assessment. Usually that would spit back out that 1,300 calories is just to keep you alive. And then based on that, well, everybody was different. That was just kind of like the standard average number that I would see. And then your consumption would change based on if you were to work out or you wouldn't. So obviously you would eat less if you didn't work out that day. You could eat a little bit more if you did.
Yeah.
So how did they determine that calorie number? Was it 2,000? Was it less than that?
So in a lot of papers, it's going to be completely different. Some papers just simply track body weight. And so if body weight doesn't change significantly, you know that they're not in a calorie surplus or a deficit, because when you're in surplus or a deficit, you see weight fluctuate, and that's pretty clear. Some labs will go even more in depth and do a DEXA scan, which people may be familiar going in, looking at bone mineral density. It tells you how much, not just weight, but the composition of everything. So how much fat do you have, how much muscle, how much bone, how much everything. And so you can see what would happen in a calorie surplus and a deficit, so you can track these things. Now, as far as what are you burning day to day, that 1,300 number is extremely low. And your basal metabolic rate, which is what you're bringing up, is not actually what contributes to total energy expenditure in a day. And you can measure basal metabolic rate, so that 1,300, by having someone just come in. And we did this stuff in the lab where people would come into the lab and get hooked up to that metabolic cart that I know you were using, and you can measure how much oxygen they're taking in and utilizing. If you know how much fuel they're burning, you can get an idea of how much calorie expenditure they've got. And they just lay there for 30 minutes and are just chilling, so that you can see, at rest. You've got these people that are just sitting there.
I had to put a little towel over their head, and they basically had almost be sleeping, but not fully sleeping. Yeah. That's kind of where we're at.
And then you can plot that out over 24 hours and see. Most people are burning about 100 calories an hour, which ends up being around 2,400 calories a day. And that's not going to be the same for everybody. But then you have exercise calorie expenditure, which isn't going to be a significant amount, a few hundred calories per day. And then you have the thermic effect of food, where certain foods that you take in, you're utilizing energy to break them down. And then you have what's called NEAT, non-exercise adaptation thermogenesis. And this is things like fidgeting or just moving around day to day. All those things contribute to total energy expenditure. So if you know these values and can estimate them, you can give somebody a specific calorie expenditure and or calorie intake recommendation. And doing just a DEXA scan gives you a good idea based on somebody's lean body mass, which is more metabolically active. We know they're going to burn more calories. And that's why if you do a body composition test, you're going to see estimated calorie expenditure in a day. So you can get that information. It is an estimate. You're guessing. But body composition tells you.
And there are some apps that actually do that too. But it's an estimate, it's a guess. Mm-hmm. But best thing would be go get tested there and see what you're actually at, because everybody's so different.
And you can know yourself by monitoring weight and if you're in a calorie deficit or not.
Yeah. And is there anybody that should stay away from doing a calorie deficit? Are there like people like, hey, you should definitely stay away from something like this? Like, what are the risks with it?
Yeah, so definitely not as you're developing. So you need energy to grow. So, first 25 years of your life, if you don't have any metabolic issues or anything poor with your health and are not obese, calorie restriction is probably not going to be a benefit for you.
So if you're under 25, usually that's around the age that you stop developing typically. And you're overweight, you wouldn't recommend it for somebody like that. Well,
I shouldn't say that. If you're there's a period of time, up until puberty that your growth plot is going to be a lot higher.
Yeah.
And that's the dangerous point of like, you really don't want to go in and do a calorie restriction diet when people are growing. And this was shown in that monkey study where the juvenile monkeys, 1 to 2 years old and 1 to 3 in the female group, it wasn't beneficial for them to start calorie restriction then. And so, it's tough to put a number on that, but I'd say as you're growing, calorie restriction is not going to be a friend. And then as you get to like later in life, when you don't have that capacity to build and preserve lean body mass, again, you can calorie restrict. That's just fine. But if your calorie restriction involves a reduction in protein, you're going to accelerate that muscle loss. And so that population is also at risk.
Okay.
And people that are, you probably heard people talk about BMI, and it's a crazy number. But one thing that it does tell us is, we know people that have really high BMI and low BMI are really healthy. People forget about that low BMI. So if you have a very, very low BMI, what your guess is that that individual has low amount of lean body mass, which is that muscle, and then like high amounts of body fat relative to that. And so I should say this too, you can have low body fat that's also poor for your health. And so having those two things really low, you definitely don't want to calorie restrict at that point, because not only are you going to accelerate that breakdown in lean body mass or that muscle, but you're going to become significantly less healthy. So if you're going to try calorie restriction, you want to make sure you're metabolically healthy at this point. And then also don't do it with your kids that are growing. Yeah. And I shouldn't say if, anyone who does calorie restriction, keep that protein at an absolute number. That should not change at all. And then based on the research, I wouldn't venture past that 25% calorie restriction because we know it's sustainable at that 10 to 20% mark based on those clinical trials. Like, we know that people tolerate that for years at a time. So if you're going to do calorie restriction, that's a pretty good goal to have. As soon as you venture past that 25% mark of calories, you're likely going to be restricting so much that even if you do maintain protein intake, you're probably still going to break down muscle. So a good rule of thumb is try not to lose 1 to 2 pounds or more than 1 to 2 pounds per week of just total overall weight, if that's what you're using. Because what that does is it keeps you at this nice sweet spot of you can still preserve lean body mass. As soon as you try to drop weight more than 2 pounds, that's coming from muscle. So people try to accelerate weight loss because they get on these health kicks and like, I'm going to restrict calories and starve themselves. Like, I lost 7 pounds in the first week. Well, you could tell them like, you're an idiot because like you're actually less healthy than a week ago, because the majority of that you can guarantee came from muscle.
Huh. And the biggest loser, they're losing like 10 pounds a week. Like those people it was just insane.
And that's the problem, is everyone's so focused on weight, but they are not healthier. And in fact, more often than not, they are less healthy at that time point than when they started.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Looks like I'm not going to do that anymore.
No, you could calorie restrict. Like I'm saying, do it.
But I've been doing it wrong.
Research is incredible.
Very wrong.
Just keep that protein
high.
And then I wouldn't mess with more of like, for you, I'd say, you don't want to be in more than a 500 calorie per day deficit.
Right.
And, if you extrapolate out like how many calories you need to reduce to lose a pound, it's 3,500 calories equals 1 pound. So if you do 500 calories a day, you're at 3,500 at the end of the week. that is 1 pound of weight lost. If if you're tracking them correctly.
Okay.
And so that's a good rule of thumb is, you don't want to venture past that because, again, then you can be less healthy.
I think just the hardest part is knowing where you're at, what number you got to hit. That's still just, I think the golden standard is just still that 2,000, like kind of what we're talking about. But you can do the test, but like I know a lot of people don't want to do the tests. So finding that option without doing all those tests is going to be tough.
I'm right around 2,800 calories a day.
Oh, okay.
Is not, that's what I, would take in and maintain weight. And so if you don't want to go in and do a body composition
1,800.
test, no, you're at a lot more than that. That's just probably what your basal metabolic rate on an app is telling you. You're at more than that. Now, and so what you should do is go track what you're eating in a given week when you're focused on, taking care of your health and eating intentionally throughout the week. Track what you're taking in, monitor your weight too. If you know you've sustained weight for a period of time, just pay attention to what you're eating. That is the calorie intake you're going to go off of. And now you've got that calorie number, and then you can reduce that. Don't worry about going in and get a body composition test. If you have access to it, great, do it. It's going to be more accurate. But if you don't have one, then all you got to do is just find a period of time where you're sustaining weight and you're eating habitually, something that you're not like, 1 week on vacation eating a shit ton of food. Like, resemble it more of like a natural week for you. And then you just calculate on average how many calories per day were you having in that given week, and that's your starting point.
Okay. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that was a great breakdown. Yeah, a lot of people I had use MyFitnessPal, and that's a great way to track. It's a free app. Yeah. And you just track your food, and then you can tailor it how you said.
Little plug for MyFitnessPal. Yeah, a lot of people like that. Little plug.
Awesome. I'm excited to hear what you have to say about intermittent fasting, because I learned a lot about.
I'm glad we started with calorie restriction, because intermittent fasting.
That's something.
Tune in for part 2.
I've done that for 5 years now, and like I see good results, but like I definitely want to see this. Might
I'm
going
to convince you.
I want to eat more.
It might change it. Yeah.
I want to eat more in a day.
I think
protein.
I love food.
Yeah.
Me too. That's the hard part. Well, and that's the thing. And I'm not going to, spoil anything for the next podcast, but it's like you said, you want to eat more food. It tends to be difficult for people, and there's certain diets that are better for certain people. But tune in to part 2.
Nice.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Any other questions? We got it. That was it.
I think
nothing else.
Wow. I learned a lot about monkeys today.
I was already ready to cut it out.
I learned
a lot of monkey stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll miss you guys.
Thanks again for tuning in to the Kickback Science Podcast. We love talking science with all of you, and if you feel the same, you can support us by subscribing, hitting that like button, and giving us a follow on our social media pages. Don't forget, you can submit questions through our website and in the comments section of all our social media. Have a good one, everyone.